Right, so this is the video catch-up, explainer, recap, summary, whatever you want to call it, on feminism. And in this case, we're looking at Simone de Beauvoir. She's our first key thinker, one of five key thinkers in our feminism topic. So lots of the ideas we're going to see with Simone de Beauvoir are ones that actually are already kind of familiar with us because she's the kind of founding thinker about them, and they become popularized later on in the 1960s as second wave feminism. So we'll try and explain what the words are, what the ideas are. We'll try and relate them to human nature and society and the economy and the state as we're going through. And we'll try and think a little bit about what other feminists think about Simone de Beauvoir too. Now, I'm not going to play this now, but you will, when you get a chance, have an opportunity to play this video. It's a YouTube 2.5 minutes or so. And it unpacks what is one of Simone de Beauvoir's most famous phrases from The Second Sex, which is the book that she wrote, which is most celebrated. Women, she says, are made and not born. In other words, the way in which women behave, the way in which women are, is not a biological fact. It is something which is constructed by male patriarchy, by a male-dominated society. And in the video, in reflecting on what she talks about, she considers beauty standards, the way in which women present themselves, the roles they play, even the way in which they think about each other, the way in which they think about other women and reinforce those things, are not chosen for them. They're created by a male-dominated society. So this fits in with what we were talking about last week, where we thought about sex and gender as being some of our core ideas that most feminists agree on, and that gender being something which is socially constructed. But it's socially constructed by an unequal society which is dominated by men. Okay, so in this case then, I've set you a little bit of homework to do, which is to read Kelly, the Political Ideas book, and obviously the PDF is in Classroom. You can find it already. And looking at that text, you should be able to make your own notes. But I also said, look, these are so important. We'll try and whiz through these ones in the session. So this is what we did. We talked then about, in the first case, existentialism, which often seems to lots of people like a kind of complicated philosophical idea. But Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, who kind of more or less invented the modern philosophy of existentialism, I suppose, were interested in particular in thinking about why are we who we are and why do we behave like we do. And what they were keen to do was to unpack, to get us to reflect on our essence, our true human selves, and realize that in most cases, we don't actually behave as we would want to. How we've been constructed, our identities have been constructed as women, as men, as people of particular social classes, as people of particular ethnicities. And those things are beyond our control. So the first step in becoming free and being able to have some control over that is to understand what it is that's making us up. So there's a reflection thing about this. And de Beauvoir said that when we begin to do that, we realize that we're often living in bad faith, that we're being dishonest with ourselves, that to go through the motions that have been created for us by somebody else or by something else is not to properly exploit our potential as human beings. And that bad faith is a kind of morally, once you know that you have not made yourself, then it's morally the right thing to do is to do what you can to take control of your own lives. And that's why she talks about, following on again from Jean-Paul Sartre, about the idea of living an authentic life. So what women should do is recognize that as women, they have been living in bad faith, and they should therefore seek to live authentic lives as independent women by, in her case, relinquishing or getting rid of the idea of marriage, living financially independently, living independently in a relationship basis in terms of not being emotionally dependent on someone as well. Okay. The other really important aspect of the second sex and of Simone de Beauvoir for us was this idea of otherness. And here she's thinking about the way in which women are portrayed and the way in which women then internalize the ideas of themselves, which make them behave in ways which they haven't necessarily chosen. And that idea of otherness means, or is reflected in patriarchy in the way in which she says Men are the absolute and women are the other. And that means that the norms in society are male dominant norms. In the lesson, again, I made a reference to football about this. When people talk about the fact that they're going to watch the football at the weekend, they say, without even being explicit about it, that what they really mean is the men's football. And if we're going to watch women's football or talk about women's football, we call it women's football. And in all sorts of ways, these dominant norms, since they express the standard, the main thing, the normal thing is the male thing, then everything else that comes after it is not only other, but it's also somehow inferior. So manageresses or actresses are seen as, not proper actors, but the kind of female version of that as well. And Simone de Beauvoir was wanting people to recognize this and therefore see, one, how unfair this is, but how society should change or should recognize that it's being dominated by male norms and seek to offer equal ones. So this has an impact on the third thing, which is about the roles that women play in society. And since women are made, not born, that means that the role of housewife that they play, or primary caregiver, or main parent, is a maternal role. But there's nothing about that kind of maternalism which is biological or of necessity. And she argues that these roles are created by a male-dominated society. And as such, since women don't choose, she looks at all of the different ways in which the choice for women about how to live their lives has been taken from them. So this is really about the mechanics of that existentialism we talked about before. What are the processes going on? So she's considering socialization from a very early age, education or exclusion from education, so that women are imprisoned in a series of ways in which they're having to live through this bad faith. So how do we do something about this, or what would she have argued that we should do about this? Well, one, if we've understood as an existentialist the things that have been acting on us as forces to make us behave in bad faith, then we're going to seek to live an independent life. And that's going to be about enabling women's choice for work, so to make it possible, viable for women to live an independent life. But there's an individual aspect there for women as well, that women have got to end their own complicity in the system. And she came in for quite a bit of flack for this from other women, other feminists even as well, that the idea of self-liberation meant that women had to recognize that if they were in a marriage or if they were mothers or whatever it happened to be, that those things, they were being complicit in their own oppression. And they could not be happy in their own oppression either. And therefore, what women had to do was to stop judging other women by standards that had been created by men. And this applies not just to motherhood, but to beauty, to relationships, to sexuality, to things like abortion and all sorts of things which were controversial at the time in the 1940s and 50s, in which she was saying it isn't just men who are upholding these patriarchal norms, it's often women, and other women are judged by those women, and other women are being controlled by those women. So women have got to end their own complicity in the system. Okay. Here, I just left a few key quotes, and what I normally do in the lesson is put these out, give them to a pair, and then get the pair to tell me about the significance of them. I think I won't do that in this video, but I think they're useful for you. You're just able to be able to drop them into a bit of writing. It'll save you reading the entire 600 pages or so of The Second Sex. But in each case, they tell us something about one aspect of Simone de Beauvoir's feminism, what she's preoccupied with, and allow her to be kind of interpreted as sometimes a liberal feminist, and sometimes radical feminist, and sometimes even someone who's also interested in class and other forms of oppression as well. Okay. Some few facts. We were talking about the context of where Simone de Beauvoir got these ideas from. And I made the point about the fact that she was a left-bank intellectual philosopher from Paris in the 1940s and 50s. So there's something about the social context of liberated Paris, which had been under Nazi occupation, which had its own kind of almost like a revolutionary counterculture movement at the end of the 1940s, where people were living a kind of free sexuality, experimenting with things like same-sex relationships, where lots of Black Americans who'd been soldiers, who'd been active in the liberation of Paris at the end of the Second World War, stayed in Paris because it was less racist than the US where they'd come from and where they faced segregation as well. So she built her ideas based on the fact that at the end of the Second World War, people were constructing their own lives and not living as they'd been made to live before. They weren't living in bad faith. The end of the war provided them with an opportunity to live authentic lives. So for her, this seemed like a realistic opportunity. Okay. So, and we put this question just in order to get us to think about the fact that Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex isn't actually only writing about sex. And she draws an analogy with the way in which women are oppressed, with and identifies it with the way in which Black people are oppressed in America and the way in which colonial peoples, France had an empire, of course, and colonial peoples are oppressed by the empire countries or by the host countries. And what she was talking about was the way in which, Black people also are othered, that there is a white standard in society, and therefore, Black people understand that the norm is the white, and therefore everything that's not white is somehow seen as inferior. And that's what she was talking about in terms of if we understand what racism is, then we can understand the problems that colonial people face, then we should probably use the same tools to think about the way in which women face a society which is dominated by men, and women are othered, women are made to feel inferior as well. In its way, this is really kind of far ahead of its time, because in some ways it's a bit like a kind of the beginning of an understanding of intersectionality, which gets lost in the way in which she's kind of appropriated by second wave feminists in the 1960s. Okay, I asked a few questions here, which I actually said I wanted people to go away and think about and then come back and talk to us about. But here, I guess we'll talk just very briefly about what kind of bullet points you would put in. So this first one on the top left-hand corner here, women are forced to live in bad faith in having to live in ways that they haven't chosen. So that idea of being constricted as someone who's dependent financially on men, somebody who has to adopt a kind of sex role as the partner, as the wife of a man, as being mothers, and there only being kind of one choice about being, the primary caregiver. These are the ways in which women are forced to live in bad faith, from which they should break free, from which they should self-liberate, as far as she's concerned. When it comes to women being complicit, I've made a few references about this as well, but women making judgments about other women's sexuality because it's different from their own. That might be to do with promiscuity, or it might be to do with to do with sexual choices, like same-sex relationships. Simone de Beauvoir had a series of different relationships with men and women, and was very open about that with her other partners and things as well. And so she was saying is that if you're not true to yourself, like in terms of your sexual being as well, then that's also a way of being complicit with the system. This last one is about the limits of achieving freedom as being an independent woman. And I think one of the ways in which other types of feminists might criticize her, particularly maybe socialist feminists as well, is to say, well, okay, this is Simone de Beauvoir, who came from a pretty well-off bourgeois background, who was allowed the freedom to study philosophy, and therefore for whom it was more possible to simply strike out and say, right, I'm going to live as an independent woman in the 1940s and 50s. Still a very brave thing to do, but probably just practically beyond the reach of lots of women who are already working class, may already have dependents, which may be part of their working class extended family, or indeed may have their own children as well. And not everybody can, achieve a kind of financial independence by writing a book about philosophy and then be invited to tour around America. And I think she recognized that her lifestyle wasn't necessarily possible for everybody. But the level of independence is difficult for women, particularly weaker women who are in weaker social situations, to be able to strike out and do what they want. So this last one, is she a liberal, radical, or socialist, is I kind of think interesting for us as when we're thinking about feminist key thinkers. The reason for this is, if you think about when we've looked at socialism, liberalism, and conservatism, almost always when we look at a key thinker, they're really clearly attached to a strand of something. So John Locke is a classical liberal, and John Rawls is a modern liberal, and Edmund Burke is a traditional conservative. But with feminism, we have a couple who are kind of like pretty closely attached. So Kate Millett is a radical feminist, and Sheila Rowbottom is a socialist feminist. But when we come to look at some others, they're a bit more difficult to pin down, and Simone de Beauvoir is also one of those. So she seems often like a liberal feminist because she's interested in individual freedom and individuals breaking away. And indeed, lots of liberal feminists in the 1960s appropriated that bit of her thinking. Betty Friedan is that as well. So to be an independent woman is to be able to take part in work in the same way that men do. And that means, therefore, competing in capitalism in the same way that men do. And that makes her look as though she's a liberal too. But I don't think she is. She was a lifelong member of the French Communist Party. And that meant that class was always really important to her. So one of the things that she has as a goal is a time she looks forward to when men and women can be side by side as workers and gender isn't important. So in that sense, she's interested in workers resisting capitalism and understanding the oppression of class as well, even if most of the time she's talking about women's role in society. But she could be seen as a radical feminist as well, and that's because she was intensely interested in the way in which she could and women could use aspects of their private sphere of life, their sexuality, the way they chose to live their lifestyles, and use those as political choices about how you cease to live in bad faith, how you cease to live in ways in which patriarchy has created something for you, and choose to live different ways. So she was involved in same-sex relationships with a series of women through the course of her life, and she saw these as part of her obtaining her independence, or a separation from the role that had been portrayed for women, or the type of sexuality that had been created for women in the 1940s and 50s. Okay. Oh, that's, I think, almost time for us to be finishing with Simone de Beauvoir. But there are, for those people who are dead keen on looking at some extra resources, here are a couple. So you can spend 10 minutes looking at an article which you can use to add to your notes. It's quite a good one from The Guardian. Or you can listen to a podcast. In this case, I've put it on a YouTube video, but it'll do the same job for you as well, which is a bit of a longer discussion about the legacy that Simone de Beauvoir has. All right, that is your recap on Simone de Beauvoir. Hope that did everything you needed it to. If you've got any questions about it, always nice for you to come back and ask me about them. Okay.